So the goal of this conference is to discuss strategies to achieve long-term reductions in violence. So naturally, we look to cases that have already achieved this goal. We have, for example, the Great American Crime Decline, the Great Sao Paulo Homicide Drop, and the Medellín Miracle. And examining past declines can help us identify effective tools needed to reduce violence in the next 30 years. And as we heard extensively, cities will play an important role in this decline. So with this in mind, I examined successful violence reductions in cities across the globe with a focus on the municipal strategies, and there's many, many different strategies that have been taken to specifically reduce violence. So first I'll say a few words about my methodological approach. I wanted to select cities in different geographical contexts with different levels of violence and different degrees of decline. Now, this was to see if there's any universal strategies or if we have to look at specific socio-political and cultural contexts, and I imagine it's a bit of both. But in other words, can the lessons learned in New York City, for example, inform violence reduction in Cape Town or Karachi? Now, because cross-country comparisons of cities are problematic, I also include cities within the country to try and match a successful city and a less successful city, so-called. So we have cross-country comparisons as well as within-country comparisons. So my approach was to review all of the literature I could find, whether that be academic or scientific or journalistic, anything out there on the strategies used to reduce violence in these cities. And since I am also dealing with cross-country comparisons, I'm using homicide specifically. So I'm dealing with specific lethal violence in these cases. Some cities have not yet reached 50%, but some of them are on their way. So I considered, this is my question. What can we learn? The basic question, the overarching question that I asked in approaching this huge project was, what can we learn from the successful violence reductions in cities? So this covers a range of different categories of criminal justice, education, health, and there's different kinds of policies like urban regeneration. We already heard a lot of them. And these are things that cities can change. We've talked a lot about this. But I also considered a range of other explanations, and one of them is demographics, but the other one is changes in structure of organized crime in cities, or gang truces that we're not controlling. And these are things that we can't really change, or changes in the drug markets, global drug markets. So these questions formed my major overarching question. But before I begin, it's of course important to mention that throughout the sample, there's an extreme lack of evidence, and I think we've already probably touched upon this as well. So it's not going to be, in my conclusions, I'm not going to be able to say what works, and I don't think I'm qualified to say that based on the evidence out there and based on the review. So be aware that there's still many uncertainties about the effectiveness of these strategies in these successful violence reductions. So I'll briefly introduce the cities that I use within the sample. I selected 5 countries, and of course, this is based on time and what I could get my hands on, but people are here from all over, so if you have another case in the discussion, please let me know. So we'll start with the most famous crime decline, the Great American Crime Decline, which doesn't look that great in this scaling. But the city I'm focusing on now is New York, the New York crime decline. In New York, homicide rates fell 72% in 8 years, so that's that first major crime decline. After 1998, homicide rate declined more slowly, coming down to around 5 offenses, and this is police data, per 100,000 by 2012. Now, New York City, of course, was not the only city to see declines. Homicide and violence and other types of crime declined all over the country. In Chicago, a city comparable to New York, at least in size, also saw a significant decline, but the decline started later, it was less dramatic, and homicides are still overall much higher than New York. Second, I considered Colombia, which was once considered the most violent country in the world. In Colombia's capital, Bogota, homicides declined steadily since the early 90s. In Colombia's second city, Medellín, now referred to as the Medellín Miracle, is once the home of Pablo Escobar and the Medellín cartel. Medellín's homicide rate was higher than countries at war. And its endemic violence was due to a very complex combination of factors, including the presence of numerous armed groups that are competing for territory in the criminal markets in the city's peripheries. There are two significant declines in Medellín. The first one was in the early 90s, but I'm going to focus on the second one that started in 2002, in which homicide declined 77% in 11 years. However, Colombia's third largest city, Cali, the home of the Cali cartel and a strategic location for drug trafficking, did not see comparable declines in the same period. You see a bit of decline, but overall it's still one of the highest. Next, we hop over to Brazil, where national rates are actually increasing. However, in two major cities, Sao Paulo and Rio, we have seen significant declines. In Sao Paulo, 76% in 12 years, and in Rio, 57%, although it has two little separate peaks. So we also have South Africa, which country has seen a steady decline. Johannesburg's homicide rate has also seen a decline, but Cape Town has not seen the same pattern, at least based on police data. Finally, we turn to Scotland, which might sound a little odd. It has the lowest overall rate of homicide out of all of these, but one of the highest in Western Europe. And Glasgow has been called, Scotland. Glasgow has been called the most dangerous city in the UK before, and homicide rates have actually declined about 57% in Glasgow since 2005. And this is in comparison to Edinburgh, where homicide rates are generally low and unchanging, but Edinburgh is comparable in size and very close in culture to Glasgow. And some of you may be thinking Glasgow seems like a bit of an odd choice next to Cape Town and Medellín. But Glasgow is an important case, at least I think so. It is long been considered one of the most economically deprived areas in the UK, so much that health studies spend a lot of time trying to explain the so-called Glasgow effect, with the significant gaps in mortality, even controlling for socioeconomic status. In particular, males in Glasgow report a significant excess in alcohol consumption, controlling for other socioeconomic factors. So Glasgow presents an important case to try and understand homicide declines in Western Europe and more developed countries. So what are the strategies cities use to reduce violence? There's no shortage of explanations, and there's no way I could cover them all here, so I'm going to give you one of the most, buzzwords, or one of the most common that I could find, is this approach of a multi-sectoral reform. And of course, I should mention again that academic evaluations of these declines, either quantitative or qualitative, are severely lacking, and they're uneven. So we have much more evidence of declines, evidence of these types of interventions in the U.S., for instance, and Colombia and Brazil, than in places like South Africa. So if I lean on some cases more than others, that's the reason. So my goal is to create a list of these policies and strategies, and by doing so, we can extract these lessons about decline. So multi-sectoral reforms involved a coordinated municipal-level approach to reducing violence in many different root and situational causes. And this includes criminal justice institutions, aspects of health and the economy, as well as infrastructure, which we talked a lot about here as well, and housing, and education. So you can see a couple of the examples up there. There's also a component, at least in some of them, of civic anti-violence campaigns. So one example here, I'll just give you a brief overview, is the Bogota City Security Campaign, which started in 1993 by a mayor. We talked about the role of mayors, I think, plays a big role, and I'll come back to that. But he instituted very broad institutional changes, a lot of it centering around police reform and improvements. He increased the budget, police presence, education training, the computer database, so it's like CompStat. Police were accountable for crime in their area. He also put restrictions on firearms and alcohol. and initiated huge campaigns to try and change attitudes and behaviors about violence. Job training, employment, this typical stuff that you find, improved infrastructure, and improved public spaces. And you can find a lot of these different types of multi-sectoral reforms across these cities. So I am on this page. So these strategies are aimed to address the causes of violence in many different ways, but of course we don't really know which components are operating, which components are reducing violence actively in any sort of particular situation. But given this overview, we can at least, this is the Medellín Metro Cable, we could probably gloss over that. In fact, maybe I'll mention there was a study, you probably know, of the impact of the Metro Cable, and it showed that in comparable neighborhoods, it actually did reduce violence compared to comparable neighborhoods. But another study also showed that it's overworked, and a lot of people don't use it, in fact, because it takes a long time, there's long queues, there's too many people on it, so they end up taking the buses anyway. So there's pros and cons to these sorts of infrastructure implementations. So we can summarize our multi-sectoral reforms in these broad categories. We have policing, social and economic opportunities, firearms, alcohol, cultural change, and access to public space. The details of these policies and programs differ across the cities, but the common characteristics seem to be this multi-sectoral coordinated approach to identifying and tackling these local problems. Of course, again, whether or not they're successful is another thing. Now, this all sounds very positive. But there are other possible explanations out there and changes in levels of violence that have been highlighted by many researchers, not just me. One alternative explanation is demographics, and I won't go over this because basically talked about that earlier. But evidence of demographic changes is also very mixed on the effect on violence. Now, a second explanation is that changes in drug markets or organized crime or gang activity fuels these declines. Now, there are two types of changes caused by state interventions, such as dismantling the Medellín cartel, extending diversionary programs, or targeting weapon-carrying gang members. And these are changes that, of course, cities can implement. But there are changes caused by factors outside of our control, too, such as gang alliances, or maybe unless you negotiate a truce, the monopolization of power of one gang over an area, or changes in drug consumption and demand or the global drug market. Now, changes in gang activity, I think, make sense for many of these cases. So across cities, I won't do that too fast. Across cities, from Medellín to Johannesburg to even Glasgow, gang activity, especially related to the drug markets and alcohol and firearms, makes up a significant proportion of lethal deaths. And Alfred Bloomstein, I think that's his first name, argues that the rise and fall of crack cocaine in the U.S. is one of the best explanations that fits with the timing, the degree, and the decline of homicide or violence in the U.S. So in Medellín, one competing explanation, I just want to give this as a case study for the miracle, is that after the government launched an aggressive military campaign in one of the revolutionary armed forces of Colombia, FARC-controlled neighborhoods, in 2002, essentially the paramilitaries and the AUC, this is some arguments of critics, took control of these neighborhoods. Prior to this, much of the violence in Medellín could be attributed to conflicts between gangs or conflicts between armed groups of some kind or armed groups exerting control over the area. And some report that the leader of the paramilitaries in Medellín, who was called Don Berna, tightly controlled the use of violence in his criminal network. Now, contributing to this change in the structure of organized crime was the AUC's subsequent agreement for demobilization in 2003. Here's just a timeline of what I'm talking about. Now, despite being called a success, many critics argue that the disarmament did not actually alter the structure of organized criminal groups or criminal groups in general in the city. Indeed, when Don Berna was extradited in 2008, which you can see there, violence doubled in the city as gangs competed for territory. Recent declines in El Salvador and Mexico, although they also have similar multi-sectoral reforms, people have also argued that gang truces or gang alliances or monopolizations can account for changes in homicide trends. But this explanation is so difficult to measure. How do we get data on criminal governance or criminal organizations? But despite this shortcoming, understanding the structure and nature of gangs, at least in cities, and the illicit networks and the organized crime groups, can tell us a lot about the problem and highlight the type of strategies. How much time do I have?
You're fine.
Okay, good.
You just clarify what you meant by demobilization.
The demobilization process was essentially the formal process of giving up the guns and leaving the AUC. And it was coupled with a lot of other services for these paramilitaries. And studies on it have shown that it's not just paramilitaries who demobilized, so it was like there was a formal ceremony coupled with a lot of follow-up aspects of paramilitaries handing over guns and then signing up for the social services that would follow. And so essentially they were giving up life of the paramilitary.
At the end of wars, virtually in every single post-conflict situation, you have a process called disarmament, demob, and reintegration. And the idea is that you have a pact, some kind of truce, you negotiate an amnesty, and then you have people go through a sequence process of handing in their guns in exchange for incentives, and then they demobilize. And in Colombia, there are 31,000 paramilitaries in 2000, 2003 who were demobilized and reintegrated. And it's very controversial in Colombia, as you were saying.
Yeah. Does that help? Okay. So, with all of this information, what does this tell us about successful violence reductions? Each success on its own doesn't tell us much. But when we start comparing these strategies, a new and more complex picture of city-level reforms and violence trends emerges. So, for example, let's consider again the multi-sectoral reform. It involves an impressive coordination between criminal justice and other social and non-governmental programs. It has something for everyone: policing, education, health, infrastructure, alcohol restrictions, firearm restrictions. Great. But in fact, the pioneer of this multi-sectoral reform was Rodrigo Guerrero, the mayor of Cali in 1992. Guerrero considered violence from an epidemiological perspective and managed to implement a wide array of reforms. He essentially did everything right. He was a progressive mayor, although still attached to traditional political parties. Many of these programs, including expansion and training of the police and the Comstat style, were later implemented in Bogota and Medellín. But to date, homicide rate in Cali still remains very high, extremely high, much higher than Bogota, which implemented same or similar reforms, and unpacking this might help us understand. But there are two potential lessons we can learn from this. One is that nothing works, and violence is subject to things outside of our control. So we can implement as many things as we want, but maybe changes in the gang structure, demographics, something, global drug markets, what have you, changes violence. Okay. But another one is more optimistic, I guess, and it's proposed by Gutierrez and his colleagues, and that is that political and institutional contexts matter in the success, implementation, and enforcement of these strategies. Political institutions that are corrupt or clientelistic or lack accountability to the public do not need to implement and enforce universal reforms to get reelected. And sometimes they even benefit from the presence of criminal networks. Now, Gutierrez and colleagues, as well as others, argue that the mayors of Bogota and Medellín were able to build on coalitions that broke away from these clientelistic and corrupt interests. They also actively sought support from the media and the citizens in order to increase accountability and strengthen transparency. Subsequent mayors followed their lead, and policies and strategies gained traction. Coalitions can be fragile, however, and future politicians can dismantle or not enforce these policies or strategies or whatever it entails. But as some authors argue in an analysis of policy implementation in Bogota and Recife, which both saw violence declines, once institutional institutional reforms do gain traction and politicians become truly accountable to the public for security issues, then there will be political consequences for scaling back on these initiatives. So the role of politics and institutions in general is understudied, I think, and I'd like to study it a lot more. But these analyses suggest that it might be a promising avenue of research, at least in understanding the successes of violence reduction, or at least the implementation of successful, supposed successful strategies and policies. So just to wrap up, there are 4 things that I want to emphasize here, 4 lessons. The first lesson is that achieving the goal of 50% reduction in 30 years seems possible. We have seen, at least in the cities that I've showed, a significant percentage decline in most of these cities. Of course, I paired it with not so successful ones, but even in the less successful ones, there's been significant reductions in a short amount of time, less than 30 years. But this is homicide, and others, in many of these cases, other types of security concerns persist. Other types of violence still remain high. Now, the second lesson reveals that at least some outline of a successful strategy. I'm a little worried that now that I see this term everywhere, multi-sectoral reform, that it might be becoming a buzzword and means nothing. But in any case, I will say that at least in the successful cases, they were all coupled with diagnosing and addressing local problems, coordinating policies and programs through multiple agencies and institutions. And I guess these types of things make sense in that there's multiple causes of violence, and therefore will have to be multiple strategies to solve violence. Now, the third lesson relates to the second, and the universal implementation, enforcement, and persistence of these strategies relies on strong and legitimate institutions that are accountable to the public. And I think maybe strong leaders and mayors, as you mentioned, might play a role in breaking away from these traditional and clientelistic interests in these institutions and creating a new way forward. Now, in extreme cases, this relies on them breaking away from corruption and such. But in less extreme cases, as when institutions are already fairly stable and legitimate, this may rely on gaining more localized control over violence issues, or perhaps just breaking away from general party concerns. Now, if we ignore the political and institutional context, we may be left with the misleading conclusion that nothing works or that everything works. So the final lesson is a methodological one. I think a lot of us are bringing up the question of how do we evaluate these things and what's the best way, and these massive packages or reforms present another problem as well. But I suggest that perhaps using these macro-level comparisons may be advantageous in understanding at least the implementation of these different kinds of programs. What are they implementing? When are they implementing it? How is it happening? And then does it seem to work? At least in the large-scale macro-level trends. So, and this is especially in the absence of rigorous evaluations, comparing cities or provinces that have implemented the same or similar strategies can provide us an opportunity to assess the impact and success of these large-scale strategies and city-level strategies.